Glad to be with you today. So my goal in the next 25 minutes is to share with you some concrete data on what's happening in your supply chain on decarbonization, leveraging the engagement we've done in the past 18 months with 15,000 of your probably suppliers. So I'm Pierre-Francois Thaler. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of EcoVadis. We are a purpose-led business. Our mission is to guide all companies toward a sustainable world. And we are doing this for the past 15 years now, having created the first collaborative platform for supplier sustainability ratings. So we help rate businesses all over the globe on their environmental, social, ethical performance. And we are doing this at scale, because we are now 1,500 employees working with 100,000 customers, including roughly 1,000 of the largest procurement organizations, such as, for example, all the great presenters on the previous panel, Novartis, Air France, KLM, and yes, those companies. So, decarbonization, climate change. I think if you're here, you're probably all aware that's the issue of our generation. We saw in a very vivid way in the past 2 months, reality of climate change all around the world, from terrible floods in Pakistan a couple of weeks ago, terrible droughts in China. It's really accelerated this summer. And what you also maybe know is that 80% of carbon emissions are linked to supply chain. Are you familiar with the term Scope 3? Who of you knows Scope 3? Okay, so that's a big buzzword in procurement now. So Scope 3 emissions, emissions in particular, Scope 3 related to upstream supply chain, that's for most industries, 80% of the global emissions, except maybe some very carbon-intensive industries such as utilities and basic resources. In all other sectors, we as procurement professionals are holding 80% of the problem and also 80% of the solution. But we've known this. This is not new. We've been knowing this for the past 10 years. And so what's preventing things to change? So what I often hear talking about procurement, they tell me, yes, it's going to cost more. It's much costlier to buy, sustainable or carbon, low carbon intensity products and services. And it's true. But what is also very interesting is when you compare the overall cost of decarbonization of a supply chain to the cost of the end product, the price impact is actually pretty minimal. This is a study which was published by BCG a couple of months ago, very interesting report called Supply Chain Decarbonization. They calculated that if we wanted to have a carbon-free supply chain for a car, it will be a $600 impact. For a gin, $1 impact, less than 2%. Food, same thing. So in most categories, we can actually decarbonize without having a significant increase on the overall product. That was mind-blowing for me. So why aren't we doing it? If it's not a cost problem. So the second objection or the second question I get from CPOs is we are lacking the tools. We don't have the tools to measure, we don't have the tools to engage on carbon. That's not completely true. This is a mapping of climate tech technologies. This has been booming. In the past, we've been following this space for the past 2 years. If you only look at, for example, carbon calculators, we were looking at 2 or 3 providers 2 years ago. We are now tracking 120. So you have plenty of great software tools, plenty of great technologies helping you measure. And the problem is more the opposite. The problem is what to choose, who will be the winners, and how to make sense of this very complex. But the tools are coming. So the problems are not the tools. So what is preventing us to decarbonize supply chain? And here, I want to share the result of the engagement we've done with 15,000 companies on carbon in the past 18 months. So we've been engaging 15,000 suppliers of our 1,000 largest customers to measure their carbon maturity, to look at what type of policy they had on carbon, what type of actions were they able to measure. And the results are pretty depressing. Even if you look at large companies, only 40% have relatively advanced practices, which means they start to measure, they have targets to decarbonize. But if you look at the smaller suppliers, the mid-sized companies or the SMBs, it's just a few percent. 85% of suppliers have not even started on the journey. So that's where, that's the reality of the supply chain. You need to understand, and there starts to be a huge gap, between the expectations of the large buyers and the reality of what suppliers are capable to do. So that's an overall qualitative score. But if you look in more details what this means on concrete, quantitative indicators, it means, for example, if we talk about scope 3, if we talk about measuring their own supply chain emissions, only 10% of the large companies or 10% of the large suppliers are able to do it. And when you go down the supply chain for mid-size and small-size businesses, you're talking about less than 1%. So things are starting to change, but there is today a huge level of, very low maturity within those suppliers. And I was talking yesterday to one of you, and he was making a very nice analogy with weighting scales and people wanting to lose weight. Today there is a lot of focus on decarbonization. We don't have the right scales, we don't have the right measurement tools, but the reality is 85% of your suppliers, they don't even understand that carbon is a problem. They don't even understand that they need to lose weight in the first place. So if you focus on very sophisticated and very complex tools, you will lack the engagement of those suppliers. So how do we do this? How do we address this? So EcoVadis, we started working 15 years ago on sustainability, and we started collecting carbon data 15 years ago when very few people were looking at this. But this was only one of the 21 criteria we were looking at. It was carbon, but we were doing this part of a broader assessment. We were looking at water, we were looking at health and safety, human rights, child labor, ethics. So it was very shallow. So last year, we launched a new tool. We decided that it was very important to step up our engagement, and it was very important to go much deeper in terms of carbon engagement of the supply chain. And we launched what we call the Carbon Action Module. So why Action Module? It's because we think that what's needed is not one more carbon software tool or carbon accounting tool. What's very important is to drive engagement of suppliers at scale. And we will go in the future towards much more detailed calculations at product level and so on. But the first step is how can you really scale engagement of thousands and thousands of your suppliers. So what is this Carbon Action Module doing? It's a combination of online tools and services and data validation services. So we can create a closed loop where we start by engaging and assessing suppliers, giving them a benchmark of where they stand in terms of their carbon maturity. And then we move in capability building. We need to raise awareness. We need to help those suppliers understand what they need to do. So we have a digital academy, and we have tools to do training, capability building in different languages on this complex topic. And then we move into improvement plans. So we have tools to drive improvements, online calculators, corrective action plans, to finish by the measurement and the reporting. And what we mean by that is we often hear companies saying, okay, we want to measure now, but you need to have data. So first you need to create this process, to push companies to understand the importance, and then you will start to get data, and then we'll improve accuracy of the data. But there is a huge focus on building capacity. So is it driving change? How can we measure the change? Still very early for us, because we launched this new tool beginning of last year. But we start to see companies who are in the second cycle. We start to see companies who've been engaged in mid-2021, and we are now going into the second cycle of measurement and maturity assessment. And that's the type of change we are seeing. So between the first assessment, the first engagement of those suppliers on carbon in 2021, and those who are going to the second cycle now in 2022, so we're talking about thousands and thousands of businesses, we start to see a significant change from the companies who are doing nothing. We start to do something for the companies who have started to set up a carbon committee, set up a carbon measurement, set up objectives to moving to the next stages. I think it's significant change in a year. We have a relatively short period of time to bring everyone to the leader category. Because the leader category are companies who are really committing to go net zero. But we first need to embrace those companies. And that's maybe the message I want to have with all of you, whether you work with us or whether you work with your own tools. It's let's bring the level of the base up before trying to do very sophisticated tools for the very few leaders, which are at less than 1% today. So how is this journey structured? Going from being a beginner on your carbon strategy, both on the procurement side or on the supplier side, towards being a leader. We see different stages. If you're on the buy side, if you're in procurement, the first thing to do is probably, can you benchmark your supplier's performance? Can you already provide an easy tool to help understand where suppliers are on this journey? Second, okay, how can you accelerate change? How can you build supplier capabilities? Third step, okay, can you encourage suppliers to set science-based targets? SBTi is now a global standard. And lastly, okay, how can they be a net zero and how can they become ambassador, in your own supply chain? And same thing for suppliers. It's from managing the risk to monitoring the yearly improvements to demonstrate greenhouse gas reduction towards, we think the last step is to go to the product level measurement, to go from company level measurement or supplier level measurement to measuring the impact of products. You're working on this. We are working on this. Sorry, but that's the last stage. So, what could you do? And I think I will have time for questions. So that's that's good. So, what could you do? We've been working now with close to 100 procurement organizations on this carbon engagement, and we've seen some best practices which you think you can apply in many of your companies. So, first one, those leaders, the companies we've been very successful, they have started an engagement between their company and suppliers at the top level. So it's a CPO to CEO type of engagement. It means setting the right forums where you will invite your suppliers, not the account managers, but really senior executives at your suppliers, and showing that there is really top to top and C-level to C-level engagement on this on the joint program. We work with Schneider Electric, for example. They've been doing this in a very successful way on a wide scale, doing this type of engagement top to top with 1,000 of their strategic suppliers, and that's really the start of the journey. Second step is really create tools to measure the maturity, to measure where your suppliers are. Not only looking at the absolute figure they can provide, which are very unreliable today, but providing tools to really measure those who are making progress and those who are not. Third step, or third, very important best practice, in making sure you create also the incentives for suppliers to have this level of transparency and to engage into this decarbonization journey. So incentives, it can take different shapes. It can be incentives and penalties. We work, for example, with Salesforce. So Salesforce.com, they've added last year what they call the sustainability appendix to their contract. So all the contracts have now, this new sustainability appendix. And what the sustainability appendix is saying is asking all the suppliers to commit to do this annual scorecard and this annual maturity review of their progress. And it's also telling suppliers that in case they don't decarbonize their own operations according to science-based targets, they will be liable to pay back to Salesforce an amount equivalent to the cost of the extra carbon generated by those suppliers. So that's significant financial incentive to drive change. Third or fourth example of a very good practice is cross-industry collaboration. So at EcoVadis, we're helping 1,000 of the largest procurement organizations collaborate on this topic, but we also think it needs to be done in an industry-per-industry basis. And for example, we've been working for the past 6 years with an organization called Together for Sustainability, which is bringing together the 34 chief procurement officers of the largest chemical companies in the world. They've been working on CSR and driving improvements in their supply chain from a sustainability perspective from the past couple of years. And yesterday, they released the result of a piece of work they've been doing for already close to a year. They created the first industry standard for product carbon footprint calculation for the chemical industry. And it's a document you can look at. It's a very complex specification because you have plenty of ways to measure emissions at the product level, and they've decided to standardize. They've created the playing level fields so that all chemical companies in the world, if they want to communicate on carbon emissions of their products, they will do it with a comparable way. So that's a standard, that's a methodology document, but it's a very important step to drive change. And lastly, last great practice is leverage your existing tech stack. We see companies engaging consultants, we see companies bringing new tools, but you have so many things you can do in your existing tools, whether it's SRM, whether it's onboarding tools, to bring this, sustainability piece, to bring this carbon data collection, and leveraging the existing tech stack can make a big difference. And on this topic, maybe I can share an example, and I want to give a plug, or I want to thank DPW, because thanks to Matthias and DPW, earlier this year, we were able to meet with a startup called EcoTrek, which was one of the innovative startups presenting at DPW last year. What EcoTrek is doing, they've developed what they call sustainability data mining. It's an AI technology allowing them to scrap CSR documents and CSR certificates from all the websites of millions of suppliers. In July of this year, EcoTrek joined the EcoVadis family. EcoTrek is now part of EcoVadis. And looking at what EcoTrek is doing, we thought we could use their technology for another use case, which is also collecting all this carbon publication, carbon information on the website of suppliers. So that's an example of what you can do using the existing tools you have. I think many of you are also on the service provider side. Many of you are also developing very innovative solutions and startups. I see many of you talking about carbon, but I think in almost any space, whether you're in spend visibility, whether you're in the contract management, whether you're in sourcing optimization, you have a role to play, or you can help us drive this agenda. So we are on a journey. We have a relatively short amount of time to drive change. When I started EcoVadis, I remember we were saying, okay, that's great, we need to change in the next 20 years. That was 15 years ago. Now the message is, by 2030, we need to get to reducing emissions in line with 1.5 target. It means making a huge U-turn for all our companies. You have the opportunity to drive this change, as I think it's Superman saying, with great power comes great responsibility. So as procurement professionals, you have a huge responsibility to help driving this change. And we are counting on you to help us decarbonize supply chain. Thank you very much. And I have time for questions, if there are. Yes, there is a plan. So EcoVadis, we're a founding member of a group called, it's part of the WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. A group was set up 18 months ago with EcoVadis and with a number of leading companies. I think BASF and I think Solvay for sure, but a number of chemical companies are there. Microsoft is there, SAP is there. And what we are doing with this group and with this Carbon Pathfinder is we are creating a standard for sustainability data exchange. So we're thinking there will be a number of aggregation platforms. EcoVadis is one for sure, but there will be others. And we want to make sure to have interoperability between these different systems. So it's a bit like the telco industry. Telco industry got really successful when we were able to connect from one network to the other. So this is in development. It's early stage. We need to define the right taxonomy, the right classification of data, but this needs to happen. And similar to what TFS is doing, the automotive industry, they are creating their own data exchange. So it's happening in a number of sectors, and we want to make sure to help those different hubs talk to each other. You can check the website of WBCSD Pathfinder. So questions on Slido or in the room?
I'll stand. So my question, thanks for the presentation. My question is around greenwashing, right? With the rising demand to commit to decarbonization, to jump in there, either out of conviction or because of the need of the clients. A lot of companies are jumping in this now, but they don't really believe in it. So there is a thin line between real effort and greenwashing. Is EcoVadis considering to raise flags for greenwashing when you see it? Maybe not make it public, but at least feedback to whoever is submitting that what you're claiming is not what you do, and be careful. Because we're all afraid of this, right? So how meaningful is the effort that companies are doing? Would you think to sort of integrate that in the tool or not? Thank you.
Yes. So the question was on greenwashing and the fact that now, as this is becoming mainstream, there is also a big tendency to do it just for communication purpose. So ESG washing and greenwashing is becoming a huge topic, in the expert community in the past couple of months, because indeed there were so many companies jumping on this bandwagon in the past 12 months without necessarily doing it with the rigor and the level of commitment that you would expect. So, for example, in the finance community, all the sustainable finance world, you have now lots of very strong debate going on are those funds really green? Is it ESG washing, or is it really a tangible change? What we are doing at EcoVadis is when we rate businesses, we are making the difference between what are the external claims and what are the internal practices. And very often you see a difference. You see companies reporting a number of things, but when you look at the concrete actions which have been implemented, you have a bit of a gap. So in our rating system, we're trying to make the difference. And the next topic will be doing the same thing on carbon from a quantitative way. Being able to say, okay, how can you rate the quality of the carbon data of companies? Is it plus or minus 1% accurate, or is it plus or minus 50% accurate? We don't know yet how we will be able to do this, or if we are the ones who will be doing it. But there will be, screening system and ranking systems, and which need to balance the fact that too many people are engaging into this without the necessary rigor, maybe.
You showed in the beginning very impressively how Scope 3 impact is so huge, the majority of the carbon impact for most sectors. Then you showed how the companies in the supply chain that are responsible for the Scope 3 are actually not really, especially the smaller ones, are not ready to actually cope with this. And we know that we have targets for 2025, 2030, 2040 to rapidly decarbonize. How fast do you think we'll have to make that transition and implement a new way of supplier engagement, capability building, and the tools that go behind it to actually make that transition happen in time?
But we need to do it really fast. Now we need to, if we take the 5-step journey or five maturity stage journey, you need to take most of your suppliers, or at least those suppliers who are significant carbon emission, from stage 1 to stage 5 in the next 5 years. They need to go from okay, we don't really understand what it means to we commit to net zero, and you have basically 5 years to do this. So it means first doing it at scale. You cannot do it one company after the other. You need to find a way to do scalable engagement of suppliers. It means doing it with tools which are adapted to the level of maturity. But I'm relatively hopeful because we have seen more change in the past 2 years than what we saw in the first 13 years of EcoVadis. You really have a huge tipping point, not only in Europe. Now it's global. We are working a lot in the US. We see a huge change in the US. It started 2 years ago. We're working a lot in Asia now. In Japan, you have a big uptick. So you have a big acceleration. So the wall is getting closer and closer, but change is happening. I think there is a question here. Will you please provide an example of the science-based KPIs to measure decarbonization? So science-based target, in a nutshell, it's looking at the specific of your business. It depends on industries, and it's looking at what type of decarbonization speed you need to have in order to reach what is required by science. So, for example, typical target for supply chain, we see many companies saying we want to have 50% of our spend committing to divide by 2 in the next 5 years, or we need to have 80% of suppliers representing 80% of emissions, dividing by reducing by 30%. So it's scale and intensity. So how do you select which online trainings and topics relevant for all your different customers and sectors? So last year we launched this EcoVadis Academy, which I think is covering 26 different topics in different languages. And the way it works is looking at the scorecard and looking at the performance of suppliers. We can identify the gaps they have, and we can recommend the right training you need to take. So it's a customized learning path for on a massive scale, so that we can push companies to focus on topics which are really important for them. And last question, would you consider CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, as the collaborators of yours or as a competitor? So for those who don't know, CDP is a non-profit organization started, I think, 10 years ago. They have really defined the standard for carbon disclosure for investors. So they've made a very impressive work pushing trillions of dollars of investors to engage large companies on carbon. And we consider CDP as a partner. They can really help the large companies, the very sophisticated companies to improve. We are helping the millions of others. We are helping all the medium-sized, all the smaller-sized companies who are less sophisticated. We need a different type of tool, more digital, easier to engage with. And so, together with CDP, we think we can, provide a part of the solution. So, thank you very much. I think we're on time. And don't hesitate to reach out to EcoVadis. I think okay, it's not there anymore. But don't hesitate to go on the EcoVadis website if you want to find more information. Thank you.